Hey friends, welcome back. So we're talking about part two of the spiritual journey, the hero's journey, as one gets into our vocations as an author or the adventure of partnering with our imagination with fiction. And we've got Eric here. We're talking about the status quo. It's kind of where we begin. So the first lesson, we just talked about the overall sense of where everything goes and why it's all important. Now we're going to break it down into the four steps. So Eric, over to you. Take it away.
Yeah, well, the first thing we're talking about, right, as you said, the status quo, and it's important to sit with this, right? Because this is an important spiritual step along the way, right? If we're talking about the hero's journey, right, it's where we find Luke. You know, he's on Tatooine, he's a moisture farmer, he's got all the sand, right? It's where we find Rey on Jakku, the same thing, a lot of sand, right? It's where we find Bilbo or Frodo or in the Shire in a comfortable life, right? What is the status quo? We also could look at our own lives, at our own worlds, right? What is the status quo that we accept in our daily lives? You know, the relationships, the systems and structures at play, right? These are all questions of status quo, things that might be holding us down, or holding others down that we might want to liberate in some way, right? So these are questions of status quo. In the Ignatian exercises, the first week, as I said before, focuses on examining that status quo and with God, right? God does all things with us, right? This invitation to look clearly and plainly at sin, at struggle, at hardship, challenge, suffering, chaos, death, right? What are the things that are really poisoning our world and keeping us all from full human flourishing? Now we talk about authors and writing and fiction, right? You know, these might feel like disparate things, but they're really all connected because we're talking about sinking into our experience, and we're starting at the beginning, right? We're thinking about starting at the beginning of our own experiences and saying, okay, well,
phrase, sinking into our experience. Keep going.
Right. And that is the invitation of the first week of the exercises. And that is what is necessary, I think, to any good world building, right? If we don't sink into the status quo of Luke Skywalker, of Frodo Baggins, of whoever the main characters are in House of Dragons, right? If we don't sink into the status quo, then we don't know what the change is going to be. We don't have an expectation. We aren't on fire and say, boy, oh boy, I hope like so and so defeats X, Y, and Z. We just say, oh, okay, I guess their life is just kind of always rolling. We have to sink into a status quo because that's also where we are, right? Where do we begin? Now, we don't leave ourselves there. We don't leave our characters there. Our spiritual lives can't stay there. We sink in so we can see clearly, so we know what we need to do to grow. Now, I think that's what you have to do as you're building out any sort of character, right? As you're writing a character, where do they begin? What are their needs? What are their wants? And what drives them, right? These are basic things. Anyone who's ever thought about character knows these things. But those answers come from this deep settling into where we find our character at the beginning. And I really think to do that well, we have to do it ourselves, right? As spiritual beings. We have to sink into where we are now. And that's always, when you're writing a story, right, there's a beginning, middle, and end. In our own lives, that's not quite the case. I mean, there's an end eventually. There's the beginning, certainly. But we're kind of always going in circles and cycles. Things are rising and falling, right? Necessarily so. That's the nature of life. Things happen in these patterns. But understanding where we've begun so we know what matters to us, our own values, our own desires, our own passions, those are the things that shape our vocation, right? So if we're thinking about the vocation of an author, where does it come from? Sure, I like to write books, I like to read books, but is there something about my life that I say, boy, oh boy, I want to say something of my life that's useful to somebody else, right? I want to create, stories that are going to bring people, from Tatooine all the way to the Death Star, right? These are some of those things that invite us to find a deep anchor where we can then go forth from.
I think just hearing you talk about this, one thing that I've really grown to see, and I think is insanely important with our own spiritual, and personal development, is when we sit with our characters, like you say, we sink into the experience of our characters. Notice one thing that I think we all do is we don't actually judge our characters. Like we genuinely love them, and we actually kind of don't care all of how screwed up they are and all of their flaws and how bad they are, because we know that we can stress test them enough and we can throw them into these horrible situations. They're going to emerge and they're going to learn from their mistakes and they're going to become these wonderful characters that we have intuited are amazing people and we love them, which is why we're spending all this time with them in this story. Well, it's like, what happens if you allow yourself that same sense of lack of judgment? What if instead of judging your experience, like you just say, you sink into it, you observe the fact that here's the hand of cards I was dealt, here's what I'm motivated by. If you pay attention to yourself the same way you do one of your characters, with that same sense of like, I am not perfect now, but I know that if I am put through situations and I endure and I level up, well, is this how God looks at me, the way I look at my character, or the sense of he's not actually worried by me, he's not scared by me, and everything can be brought out to goodness later as long as I do the thing that I'm supposed to do or something. What do you think?
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I like what I'm hearing too in what you're saying is this idea that we're not sinking into these stories of ourselves or of our characters or whatever to say, oh, well, that's fair, that's not fair. Or, I feel so bad because, right? It's not a search for. It's not a search for meaning in a very literal sense, right? It's not like, oh, like, well, now I've sunk into this part of myself or my story, and now I can put all the pieces together and I understand and I emerge fully aware and knowledgeable about myself. That's not quite. I don't think, at least. Yeah. It is what you said. You're just staring judgment-free and loving, delighting, right? God delights in us. We're delighting in our stories. We're delighting in our characters. And again, I go back to this quote I always say again and again. The great Jesuit Walter Burckhardt defines being a contemplative in action as taking a long, loving look at the real. And in the essay that comes from, he's very specific in saying you're not making a judgment on the real. You're not trying to put pieces in place. You're just looking at it and loving it, right, as God does. It's difficult. Like for somebody who loves to pass judgment, that's very difficult to do, and to allow the world to kind of happen. And for you're saying, well, where are we now? What's happening now? What matters now? What are the needs of this moment? What are the needs of this character? And then the story begins, right? And then the call to action, the instigating factor, all these things. But first we have to settle in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we routinely find. We put our characters through this, and I think sometimes it's okay as writers. It's what we do is we put our characters through situations, maybe because we're also trying to intuit something. We're trying to understand something about our own spiritual lives, and it is not obvious. If we try to turn our attention on ourselves, we can't see it. It sort of disappears. It doesn't become obvious. So we turn around, we practice doing that kind of attention on our characters. I think Bilbo is such a fun example of this. Gandalf shows up, absolutely terrifies him. The what do you call it? The dwarves trash his house and clear out everything, and it's like right in his face. The world I thought I lived in is not the complete, world. And then when everybody's gone, he wakes up and realizes, I've missed out on an opportunity, and now I'm going to go chasing after it. I'm going on an adventure. And I think as authors, we can do that. We can practice internally that same sort of thing. If practicing, for example, spiritual exercises feel hard and not obvious and you can't get into them, they don't make sense to you, well, this is one thing. Why writing can be such a fun thing to do and also a spiritually valuable thing to do, because in field testing characters through these kinds of journeys and things, becoming comfortable with that, you start easing your way into what you then want to go and do for yourself as a character in your own story.
Yeah. Absolutely. I just came upon C.S. Lewis's essay on fairy stories. I forget what it's called, but he says something very like this. He says, and if you don't mind, I'll read it. Yeah, it's from "Sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said." That's what the essay is called, from this book of Other Worlds. He says, why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency, could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could, he writes. And so I find myself having to kind of reread his work a couple times, but I like this idea of from our world, that's what I hear you saying, right? From our own lives, we have this kind of imposed, like, oh, this is how it must be. It's been handed down. This is my life is this way. End of story. I'll just deal with it. But when you suddenly put your world, your life, right, into the realm of dragons and fairies and elves, and literally anything's possible, right? When in those worlds, we really do believe that God can suddenly explode onto the scene, right? The world really is dripping with grace in these magical worlds. Well, then suddenly those issues, those problems, they take on a new flair. Everything is bigger and grander, and God is much more nearer, I think. So I've just been kind of reflecting on that quote the last couple of weeks, and I found it relevant here. Hopefully, I was right.